The air in Beacon's Hollow carries a dampness that never quite leaves the lungs. Some houses in this town hold silence the way others hold warmth, and some doors are sealed not to keep intruders out but to keep memory from escaping. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. In the late summer of 1952, Elias and Marjorie Navarro, a young couple who had recently moved from Boston, purchased the old Haraway estate on the edge of Casco Bay. The house had stood empty for more than a decade, its peaked roof lines cutting a severe silhouette against the Maine sky. Locals whispered that the property was cursed, though in public most described it only as unsound or unfit for modern living. The Navarros were unbothered by superstition. They were practical people, eager for space, quiet, and the chance to restore what they viewed as a forgotten landmark of New England history. The mansion was vast, 3 stories of weathered clapboard and granite foundation. Its upper windows stared blankly toward the bay, while its lower rooms sank into cool shadows even at midday. When the Navarros first walked the property, they found furniture still in place from another age, books arranged neatly on the library shelves, curtains long faded but intact. It was as though the family who had last lived there had simply risen one morning and walked out, never to return. It was during those first days of exploration that Elias noticed the inconsistency. The stairwell leading to the 3rd floor seemed to stop short. Where the roofline suggested a full set of rooms above, the hallway ended abruptly in plaster. A section of wall carried the faintest outline of a door that had been sealed with boards plastered over and painted to match. The couple laughed at first, assuming it to be some forgotten closet, yet the air around that space was noticeably cooler. Marjorie remarked that it felt as though the wall itself exhaled. Curiosity gnawed at them. One evening Elias fetched a small hammer and tapped the surface. Hollow, the plaster was newer than the rest of the room, smooth beneath the dust. Whatever had been done here, it had been done with deliberate care. The discovery unsettled them, not because of what they had found, but because of what they had not. The house's deed made no mention of alterations. The surveyor's map, drawn in 1879, showed a full set of rooms on the 3rd floor. Somewhere above their heads, a portion of the house had been walled away. Neighbors proved reluctant to speak of the Haraway estate. When Marjorie asked at the local grocer, the proprietor changed the subject. At the post office, a woman muttered something about best left shut before walking briskly away. Even the town clerk, when pressed, admitted only that the family had fallen on misfortune in the mid-19th century. No further details. It was as though a century of silence had settled as firmly as the board sealing the attic. The Navarros told themselves it was nonsense. Old houses have odd corners, eccentric modifications, rumors that gather like dust. Still, the outline of that hidden door seemed to grow sharper each time they passed the hallway. By October, they could no longer ignore it. Elias returned from Portland with a crowbar. Marjorie carried a lantern. Together they pried the first boards free. Behind the plaster lay another door, older, its iron hinges sunk deep with rust. A faint odor escaped as Elias worked the latch, stale air, tinged with something sweet and wrong, like apples left too long in a cellar. The door gave with a low groan and the couple peered into blackness. The room beyond was thick with dust, yet undisturbed, sheets draped over furniture like burial shrouds. A child's chair sat in the corner. Marjorie whispered that it looked like a nursery. The air was oppressive, heavy in the lungs, but what struck them most was the silence. No wind rattled the panes, no floorboard creaked. It was as though sound itself refused to enter. Elias lifted the lantern higher. Faint markings ran along the walls, carved by hand into the wood beneath the peeling wallpaper. Letters, half-legible, names repeated again and again. A small wooden cross leaned askew against the far wall. Its surface darkened with age. Dust clung to every surface, but there was no sign of disturbance, no footprints, no rodents, no sign that the space had been touched in years. The couple withdrew quickly, shaken but unable to say why. They resealed the door as best they could, promising to investigate further in daylight. That night, sleep did not come easily. From the floor above, faint scratching sounds drifted down. Elias rose twice to check, lantern in hand, only to find the house silent. Marjorie claimed she heard whispering, though no words could be distinguished. The following morning, they returned to the hidden space. Light revealed more detail. 3 narrow beds, aligned against the wall. Each was neatly made, as though waiting for occupants who never returned. The bedding had rotted to lace, but the orderliness was unmistakable. Beside one bed lay a book, its cover warped but intact. When Elias lifted it, a few brittle pages fell loose, covered in handwriting so small it seemed meant for secrecy. They did not yet know the scope of what they had uncovered. The records of the Haraway family stretched back into the early 1800s, a lineage marked by tragedy and peculiar beliefs. The attic had been sealed in 1874, and for 78 years it remained untouched. What began for the Navarros as curiosity would soon draw them into the darker currents of New England's forgotten history, currents that involved medicine, faith, and the boundaries of human cruelty. But in that first week of discovery, they knew only this, that 3 children had once lived and slept in a room denied daylight, that their names had been carved over and over into the walls, and that someone, perhaps the entire community, had agreed to bury their memory behind plaster. When evening fell again, Elias stood in the library below, listening to the creak of settling beams above. He thought he heard the faintest knock, as though from within the sealed room. He told himself it was the house adjusting to autumn air. Marjorie, however, would later insist she heard something else, a lullaby, broken and halting, rising from the hidden attic where no living child could be. The Navarros would soon learn what Beacon's Hollow had worked so hard to forget. Dr. Lawrence Whitford was the first outsider of standing to take serious notice of the Navarros' discovery. A physician by training, now in semi-retirement, Whitford had long been regarded as one of Beacon's Hollow's reluctant custodians of memory. Born in 1871, he had grown up hearing fragments of the Haraway family story from his grandmother, though he seldom repeated them. When Elias sought him out at his clapboard house on the edge of town, the doctor listened in silence, his pale eyes fixed on some middle distance. "You found the upper rooms?" he asked at last. Elias nodded. "They were not meant to be opened," Whitford said quietly, "though I suppose the house has decided otherwise." The physician's manner was not one of shock but of weary recognition. He explained that in the early part of the 19th century, the Haraway family had been prominent in Beacon's Hollow. Nathaniel Haraway, the patriarch, served as both minister and lay physician to the community. He was a man of rigid conviction, convinced that human weakness could be overcome by strict adherence to what he called the law of purity. His household became a place of experiment, both spiritual and bodily. Whitford leaned forward, lowering his voice though the room was empty save for Elias. "There are records in the town hall, obscure, not easily found, that speak of what he required of his children. Fasting, isolation, instruction at all hours. Some whispered of medical experiments, of bleedings and tinctures meant to drive out base impulses. By the 1830s, his practices had already attracted suspicion, yet he held sway over many in Beacon's Hollow, and few dared to confront him openly." Elias returned home unsettled, the doctor's words echoing. That evening he and Marjorie searched the sealed room again. They found the small book where it had fallen beside the rotted bedstead. Its pages, though fragile, bore clear writing in a narrow, hurried hand. The language was that of a child, but with a formality that spoke of constant correction. One passage read, "We are to keep silence until Father speaks. We are to fast until the body obeys the soul. If we complain, we are to kneel and pray until the weakness is gone." The handwriting trembled in places, as though etched in fear. Margins were filled with repeated words, patience, patience, purity. Marjorie wept over the pages, though she could not have said why. Elias photographed them with care, fearing the originals would crumble at any touch. Word of the discovery began to spread. At first neighbors treated it as idle talk, but soon older residents grew uneasy. An 84-year-old woman named Ruth Calder, one of the last in town with direct memory of the Haraway name, approached the Navarros at church. She walked with difficulty, but her eyes were sharp. "My grandmother," Ruth said, "told me she heard the cries from that house when she was a girl, but no one interfered, no one dared. The Haraways had their own rules, and the rest of us told ourselves it was not our place. That silence, it was the greater sin." Her words carried the weight of confession. She would later give a longer statement to the County Historical Society, insisting that what had taken place in the Haraway attic was known, in fragments, by more than a few. The scratching sounds, the faint voices through open summer windows, ignored, excused, explained away. The Navarros pressed further. They gained access to town archives, though many records had been misfiled or hidden deliberately. There they found reference to a church council held in 1834 in which several members had questioned Reverend Haraway's treatment of his children. The minutes noted that certain practices, though harsh, are within a father's lawful authority. The matter had been dismissed. By November, Elias and Marjorie could no longer regard the hidden attic as merely a curiosity of architecture. It was a chamber of discipline, perhaps of torment, sealed not by accident but by intention, and the town's silence had preserved it. Still uncertainty gnawed. What had become of the Haraway children? Records listed births, baptisms, confirmations, but no burials. 3 names appeared repeatedly: Mercy, Lyle, and Constance. Born within 5 years of one another, their traces vanished abruptly in the mid-1850s. On the evening of November 12th, Elias resolved to search the space more thoroughly. He and Marjorie removed the remaining boards and carried lanterns into the attic. Dust rose around them like smoke. Beneath one bed they found a carved wooden box. Inside were scraps of cloth, a broken doll, and several slips of paper covered in childish script. Each bore the same plea, written again and again in trembling lines: "Let us out." Marjorie dropped the papers as though burned. Elias gathered them silently. Neither spoke for a long time. The lantern flame flickered in the stale air, casting the carved names on the wall into grotesque shadow. In that moment, the couple understood that what they had uncovered was not simply a forgotten room, but a sealed testimony, a prison preserved intact by wood and plaster. The voices of children long dead pressed upon them, their suffering etched into every surface. The discovery would soon draw investigators, historians, and reporters. But in those first days, only Elias and Marjorie bore witness. They alone felt the suffocating weight of air that had not been breathed in 78 years. They alone heard, in the hush of midnight, the faint sound of something moving where no living presence should be. Dr. Whitford's words returned to Elias as he stood at the threshold. They were not meant to be opened, yet the seal had been broken, and whatever truths the attic contained were now theirs to confront. The winter of 1952 settled early over Beacon's Hollow, bringing heavy drifts and long nights. It was in those nights that Elias and Marjorie Navarro began to doubt the wisdom of their discovery. Once the attic door had been pried open, the house itself seemed altered. Drafts moved through sealed corridors, doors refused to latch, and faint knocks traveled along the beams. The couple kept to the lower rooms, but the knowledge of what lay above pressed on them constantly. By the third week of November, they agreed that the matter had to be placed in official hands. Elias approached the county sheriff, who dispatched 2 deputies to examine the hidden rooms. Their initial inspection was cursory. They noted the dust, the child-sized beds, the carved names. Yet when Elias showed them the slips of paper scrawled with "Let us out," their demeanor shifted. The fragments were collected in paper envelopes, tagged as evidence. Soon word reached the state police, and within days, the Haraway estate became a site of formal investigation. It was during these searches that the first remains were uncovered. Beneath the warped floorboards, investigators found a bundle wrapped in rotted fabric. Within lay the fragile bones of a child, no larger than those of a 12-year-old. The discovery chilled the men into silence. A physician summoned to the scene determined that the bones had lain there for nearly a century. The attic became a chamber of grim cataloguing. Each corner yielded some trace: scraps of linen garments, rusted iron restraints affixed to a bed frame, and a small wooden rosary, worn smooth from handling. On the walls, beneath layers of paper and plaster, investigators uncovered carvings that told their own bleak record. One panel bore the repeated name Mercy, scratched so deeply that the wood had splintered. Another held tally marks, hundreds of them, grouped in sevens, as though some small hand had tried to count the passing of weeks. The Navarros were barred from the space after the remains were found, but their nights grew no easier. Marjorie awoke more than once convinced she heard voices above, thin and pleading. Elias confessed that he had seen movement from the corner of his eye, the flicker of a figure at the top of the stairwell that vanished when he raised his lamp. The state investigators traced what records they could. Church registries confirmed the births of 3 Haraway children: Mercy, born 1843, Lyle 1846, and Constance, 18. Their baptismal entries were recorded in the minister's steady hand, but thereafter the pages fell silent. No marriages, no burials, no outward acknowledgement of their fates. A breakthrough came with the discovery of a trunk in the attic's far corner. Though swollen with damp, its contents had been preserved well enough to examine. Among faded garments lay a bundle of letters and a leather-bound journal. The handwriting matched the small script found in the children's book beside the bed. It was Mercy's. Her diary entries were terse, written in cramped secrecy. One read, "Father says we are unclean and must be purified. We are to fast 3 days and nights. Lyle is weak. Constance cries, but I hush her. If we cry too loud, we are beaten with the strap." Another, "The windows are boarded. We are told we will see the light when we are worthy. But the dark does not leave. It creeps into our dreams. Lyle's skin is pale. He cannot rise from bed. Father says prayer will make him strong, but his breath rattles like the stove." Most haunting was a passage dated November 3. "We are to remain in the room until Easter. We are not to speak to Mother. We are not to leave until the Lord shows his favor. Constance is sick. I do not think we will see Easter." The letters found among the garments were in a different hand, adult, deliberate, ink browned with age. They bore the signature of Nathaniel Haraway himself. One addressed to an unnamed brother declared, "The children are subject to the flesh, and it is my duty to discipline them unto the spirit." By December, the investigation into the Haraway attic was officially concluded. The sheriff issued his report. A historical homicide, non-prosecutable due to lapse of time, yet of such gravity that the facts must be preserved for posterity. The phrase appeared in newspapers across New England, framed in headlines that called the Haraway case one of the darkest family tragedies in American history. The bones recovered from the attic were identified, at least insofar as the surviving records allowed. One set, smaller and delicate, was assigned to Constance Haraway, age 6, when she disappeared from the baptismal rolls. The longer bones were believed to be Lyle's, perhaps 10 when death took him. Mercy's fate remained uncertain. Though her writings were found, her remains were not among those exhumed. Some whispered that she had escaped, others that her bones lay still hidden in the house's beams or beneath the soil. The children's remains were interred in the Beacon's Hollow Cemetery, marked with modest stones bearing their names and ages. The funds for those stones came not from the town treasury, but from donations that arrived in envelopes postmarked from Boston, New York, even as far away as Chicago. Strangers who had read of the case felt compelled to give dignity to children denied it in life. On the day of the burial, snow fell in great white sheets. A small crowd gathered at the graveside: investigators, townspeople, reporters, and the Navarros, who stood together in silence as the earth closed over the tiny coffins. The minister's words were brief, acknowledging not only the children but the failure of the community that had once ignored their plight. It was a reckoning spoken aloud for the first time in nearly a century. Yet the reckoning did not end at the grave. In the weeks that followed, townsfolk gathered in the hall to discuss how their own families had lived through the Haraway years. Testimonies emerged, stories of strange cries heard at night, of pale faces glimpsed in the upper windows, of whispers that something was not right in that house on the bluff. And with each testimony came the unspoken question: why had no one acted? The answer, pieced together slowly, was a mixture of fear, denial, and convenience. The Haraways had been prominent landowners, generous to the church and to local causes. To question Nathaniel Haraway would have meant questioning the town's benefactor. So silence had prevailed, and 3 children had been left to waste away in darkness. The town council voted to erect a memorial in the square, not only for Mercy, Lyle, and Constance, but as an acknowledgement of communal failure. A granite pillar was set in place, bearing the inscription: "In memory of the Haraway children, Mercy, Lyle, and Constance, whose lives ended in silence. Let their story remind us of our duty to protect the innocent and to speak truth, even when truth is hard to bear." For Elias and Marjorie Navarro, the events had shaken their sense of home to its core. Each evening they sat in the library, listening to the hush of winter wind, and asked one another whether they could remain in a house that had been a prison. Marjorie argued that to abandon it would be to abandon the children's memory as well. "If we leave," she told Elias one night, "the story will become a headline and then a whisper. But if we stay, we can make this place mean something more." In time, Elias agreed. They chose not to flee, but to remain as caretakers, reframing their role from homeowners to guardians of memory. It was then that the house itself seemed to shift. The oppressive chill that had lingered in the halls slowly faded. Doors ceased to slam of their own accord. The sense of eyes upon them, heavy and watchful, lifted. One night in mid-December, as Marjorie stitched at the fire, she realized with sudden clarity that the faint knocking sounds that had plagued them since the attic was opened had ceased. She set down her needle and whispered, "They are at peace now." The Navarros began to transform the mansion into something more than a dwelling. Elias, who worked with his hands, converted part of the barn into a shop where he carved small toys, wooden dolls, spinning tops, carved animals. These he donated to orphanages across the state. It was his way of giving playthings to children who might otherwise be denied them, a small gesture of restitution. Marjorie took over Nathaniel Haraway's study, cleansing it of dust and shadows, and transformed it into a reading room. She collected books on child welfare, on the dangers of extremism, on the importance of community vigilance. Teachers, ministers, and social workers were invited to borrow from the shelves. In the spring of 1953, they opened their home to visitors. School children came to hear the story of the Haraway attic. University researchers studied the case as an example of how religious zeal could slip into cruelty. Survivors of abuse, hearing of the story in newspapers, made pilgrimages to the house and left letters folded beneath the attic door. Letters that spoke of hidden bruises, secret fears, and gratitude that someone had finally broken a silence. The couple never charged for these visits. They considered it an obligation, not a service. The house must speak now. Elias told a reporter, "It was silent too long." The case did not fade. Across the 1950s and 60s, references to the Haraway tragedy appeared in debates on child protection law. Legislators invoked it as proof that parental authority could not remain unchecked when cruelty hid beneath its cloak. By the 1970s, social work programs taught the Haraway attic as a case study in community responsibility. The children's names, once erased, became cautionary beacons. Each year, on the anniversary of their discovery, the Navarros held a small memorial service in their home. Guests gathered beneath the attic, candles lit, and read aloud the names of Mercy, Lyle, and Constance. In the front yard, Elias planted 3 oak trees, one for each child. As the years passed, those oaks grew tall and strong.
their branches spreading wide as if in benediction. When the Navarros grew old, their own children returned each autumn to help maintain the house. They, too, inherited the role of guardian. Letters continued to arrive, some from historians, some from strangers moved by the story, some from descendants of Beacon's Hollow families, who confessed their ancestors' silence with shame. The most unexpected letter arrived in 1981, from a genealogist in Ohio. She had traced the line of a Haraway cousin who had fled Maine in the 1860s. Ashamed of the family legacy, that cousin's descendants had scattered across the Midwest, never speaking of their origins. But now, after more than a century, one of them wished to know the truth. Her name was Anne Haraway Carter. She was a great-great-grandniece of Nathaniel Haraway, and she traveled east to see the house. When she stood beneath the oaks in the yard, she wept. "I did not know," she said. "All my life there was silence, and now I understand why. But I will not let silence be the end." She laid flowers at the graves of Mercy, Lyle, and Constance. In that act, the family line, once twisted by cruelty, bent itself toward remembrance. By the time Elias and Marjorie passed away, the house was no longer theirs alone. Their children donated it to the state of Maine as a historical site. Today it stands not just as an artifact of tragedy, but as an educational center devoted to child welfare and community responsibility. Visitors walk through the rooms, study the carvings in the attic, and leave with the knowledge that silence can be as dangerous as cruelty itself. The memorial in the town square has grown as well. Over the decades, new names have been added. Other children from the region, who died from abuse or neglect. The granite pillar now carries a second inscription, words spoken by Elias Navarro in his final public interview. "The dead cannot speak for themselves. We must speak for them, and we must listen when the living cry out, so that no attic need ever be sealed again." Thus the story ends, not in silence, but in a voice carried forward of children, whose cries were once ignored, but whose memory reshaped laws, communities, and lives. Though the Navarro's story had closed with memorial and restitution, the case of the Haraway attic did not rest quietly within the archives. In the spring of 1954, state authorities transferred all documents, bones, and recovered artifacts to Augusta, where a panel of medical historians and legal scholars was convened. Their charge was to investigate not only the crimes themselves, but also the conditions that permitted them. At the head of this panel stood Dr. Edwin R. Greaves, a physician of advanced years, known for his studies on hereditary illness in rural New England. His fascination with the Haraway case was immediate and profound. "What we have here," he told colleagues, "is not merely a family tragedy, but an index of how misguided belief, cloaked in righteousness, can deform the body and the mind alike." Greaves began with the remains. The bones of Lyle and Constance were subjected to forensic examination, a procedure still crude by modern standards, but revealing nonetheless. Measurements showed severe stunting. The children's long bones were far shorter than average, their growth arrested by chronic malnutrition. The skull of Lyle bore evidence of rickets, the softened bone curving where it should have been straight. Constance's teeth, though small, displayed enamel hypoplasia, lines of arrested development, each a silent record of starvation. Even in death, their bodies testified to confinement. Vertebrae showed signs of curvature, suggesting long periods spent seated or prone. The absence of sunlight had left bones porous, their density compromised. These children, Greaves wrote in his notes, were never allowed to thrive. Their very structure tells us of the neglect that consumed them. More disturbing still were the fragments of written instruction recovered among Nathaniel Haraway's letters. One, dated 1852, read, "The children must be weakened, that their spirit may rise. The flesh is the enemy, and so we must withhold its strength. Hunger is the handmaiden of purity." To Greaves, this was not mere fanaticism, but a grotesque inversion of contemporary medical practice. He traced parallels to 19th century theories of moral treatment, wherein deprivation was sometimes prescribed to quell hysteria or excess. Haraway, Greaves concluded, adopted the language of medicine only to weaponize it, fashioning starvation and confinement into sacrament. The panel also consulted church records, which revealed that Nathaniel had corresponded with itinerant preachers, advocating doctrines of mortification of the flesh. Though fringe, such movements had drawn small followings in rural Maine during the 18th. Their adherents claimed that children, being closest to sin's root, must be disciplined through suffering to achieve purity. Most congregations rejected these extremes, but Nathaniel found in them a theology that justified his cruelty. As evidence accumulated, Greaves pressed for publication. He believed the Haraway case should be taught in medical schools, as a warning of how doctrine could corrupt care. His colleagues hesitated, fearing sensationalism, but in 1956, the Journal of Historical Medicine carried his article, The Haraway Children, a study in familial deprivation and religious extremism. The article catalogued, in clinical detail, the lesions of bone, the patterns of starvation, and the inscriptions scratched upon the attic walls. It included reproductions of Mercy's diary, her words framed as primary sources of psychological suffering. Readers were unsettled. Letters poured in, some praising the clarity, others condemning what they saw as exploitation of the children's memory. Yet the article ensured that the Haraway case entered the annals of both medicine and history. From this point, the attic ceased to be merely a local curiosity. It became a symbol in broader debates about heredity, psychology, and responsibility. Psychiatrists argued whether Mercy's writings reflected resilience or delusion. Geneticists speculated whether the Haraway's isolation bred congenital weakness. Social reformers seized upon the case as proof that unchecked paternal power endangered children everywhere. One especially grim debate centered on a single question: had Mercy survived? Her remains were never recovered, and her last diary entry suggested despair rather than death. A rumor spread that she had escaped, perhaps aided by a sympathetic servant. Genealogists scoured census rolls and marriage registries in search of her name. None were conclusive. The absence of her bones allowed imaginations to wander. Dr. Greaves himself entertained darker possibilities. In his private journal, discovered only after his death in 1968, he speculated, if Mercy lived, she bore the marks of such deprivation that her mind could not have remained whole. Perhaps she wandered into the wood. Perhaps she bore children of her own, passing on hunger and silence as inheritance. Thus the Haraway tragedy may not have ended in 1854, but may persist in bodies we have not yet named. Such musings blurred the boundary between science and Gothic fancy, yet they reveal how deeply the case disturbed even sober minds. The Haraway attic became a mirror in which doctors, historians, and citizens alike confronted the uncomfortable truth. Cruelty often wears the mask of principle, and silence gives it shelter. In Beacon's Hollow itself, the Navarros continued their vigil. Visitors brought them clippings of Greaves's article, asking if the house still felt haunted. Elias answered plainly, haunted? No, but marked yes. Every beam in that attic carries the weight of what was done. That is not something that fades. Marjorie, for her part, began compiling her own records. She copied Mercy's diary by hand, binding it in cloth, and donated copies to universities. If her words are read, she said, then she is not forgotten. That is the only justice we can give her. By the late 1950s, the Haraway case had become a fixture in classrooms and lecture halls. Students debated whether Nathaniel's cruelty stemmed from madness or conviction. Clergy cited the tragedy as a cautionary tale of zealotry. Activists pointed to it in campaigns for child protection law. In each retelling, the children's voices, once silenced in the dark, resonated anew, yet the attic itself remained closed. After the investigations ended, the Navarros kept it locked, entering only on anniversaries to light candles. Visitors were permitted to view it only rarely, and always in silence. It is not a spectacle, Elias would say, it is a grave.
The files that Dr. Greaves and his colleagues left behind in Augusta were meticulous, bound in stiff manila covers and labeled in a uniform hand. Decades later, when archivists opened those boxes, they found not just reports and measurements, but an assemblage of documents that seemed in their totality less like an investigation than a descent. At the center of the collection were the Haraway ledgers. These had been discovered wedged beneath a false floorboard in Nathaniel's study during the 1954 search of the mansion. Unlike Mercy's diary, which bore the raw voice of a child, these books were written in Nathaniel's own steady script. They were not diaries in the ordinary sense, but records, clinical, detached, yet filled with references to his children. Each entry was dated, and each described with unnerving precision the conditions of the attic. January 14, 1851. Rations withheld for the third day. Constance weakened, her voice too faint to continue reciting. Lyle still defiant, but his strength ebbs. Mercy obedient, but restless. Will disciplined through further confinement. April 2, 1852. Observed curvature in the boy's spine. Deprivation is producing the desired humbling. Constance cries in sleep. This is good, for tears wash away pride. September 8, 1853. Mercy petitions for light. Denied.
She must understand that darkness is the true tutor of the soul. It is difficult to read these words today without a visceral tightening of the chest. What Greaves emphasized in his analysis, and what later scholars echoed, was not simply the cruelty, but the tone. Nathaniel wrote as though conducting an experiment, his children reduced to subjects. Hunger became a method, cold became a measure, silence became a variable. His piety and his pseudoscience merged into one. Among the ledgers were crude charts, lines tracking weight loss, sketches of bones distorted by rickets, notes on behavior. Child less willful when belly is empty, one margin reads. Another simply, obedience rises with deprivation. Greaves compared these notes to contemporaneous medical manuals. He found passages nearly echoed verbatim from treatises on moral insanity and hereditary vice, popular among fringe physicians of the 18th. Where those texts cautioned moderation, Nathaniel twisted them into license. It was as though he had scavenged fragments of science only to weld them to his theology, fashioning a rationale for torment. But the ledgers were not the only discovery. Tucked beside them was a bundle of letters, tied in twine addressed to a name unfamiliar at first, Silas Quarles, itinerant preacher, once known to stir revivals across the backwoods of Maine. Quarles's replies did not survive, but Nathaniel's drafts did. In them he describes his progress, often in chillingly triumphant tones. The boy's cries have grown thin as reed whistles, soon he will break. The girl is already angelic in her weakness. I know you will rejoice, Brother Silas, that we are nearer to purity. The existence of Quarles added a new dimension to the story. No longer was Nathaniel merely an isolated zealot. He was in correspondence with a broader network of extremism. Researchers would later trace Quarles to other towns where families reported strange teachings about fasting children, though no other case rivaled the Harraways in cruelty. For the Navarros, reading these documents was unbearable. Marjorie confessed that she could stomach Mercy's diary, painful though it was, because it bore the innocence of a child's perspective. But Nathaniel's ledgers, she said, felt like poison on the page. She and Elias refused to keep the originals in the house, insisting they remain in Augusta under lock and key. Yet Greaves argued that to understand the scope of the tragedy, one must confront the ledgers direct. It is within these pages, he wrote, that we see how belief becomes method, and how method becomes monstrosity. The horror is not in the outburst of passion, but in the steady hand that charts suffering as though it were progress. Alongside these documents were transcripts from interviews conducted in the 1950s with townspeople who still remembered whispers of the Harraways. One, a woman named Lydia Brackett, recalled being told as a girl that the Harraway children were special, kept apart for holiness. She never saw them, but she remembered nights when faint cries drifted across the field. We were told they were prayers, she said softly, but they didn't sound like prayers. Her words, though simple, resonated with a broader theme, the complicity of silence. Families who lived within earshot, parishioners who noticed the Harraways' absence from gatherings, all had chosen not to look too closely. The ledgers showed cruelty. The interviews revealed the quiet soil in which it had flourished. The medical records, the ledgers, the letters, all were assembled in Part 2 of Greaves's published report. The section read like the anatomy of a crime. Each piece fitted into the next until the shape was undeniable. But what gave the report its enduring power was not only the facts themselves, but the way Greaves refused to let the reader escape the human weight behind them. After listing bone measurements and nutritional deficits, he would insert a line such as, "These figures, sterile though they appear, represent the body of a boy who once laughed." That tension between data and grief is what made the Harraway case a touchstone in both medical and historical study. It forced scholars to ask, how do we preserve truth without reducing lives to specimens? How do we remember suffering without making spectacle of? In the years after, Greaves's files were cited in lectures on medical ethics, particularly the dangers of treating human subjects as mere variables. Mercy's diary was paired with Nathaniel's ledgers in university courses, two voices from the same attic, one crying out, the other measuring silence. The juxtaposition haunted generations of students. Yet for all the study, the essential mystery remained. What drove Nathaniel beyond the page? Was it madness, conviction, or both? And what became of Mercy? The records illuminated suffering, but they did not close the case. Indeed, they seemed only to deepen the shadows. Marjorie once remarked that the house itself seemed to react when the ledgers were brought within. The air grew colder, she said, as though the walls remembered his words, whether mere impression or something more. It convinced her never to allow them inside again. The attic, she believed, had borne enough. Thus Part 6 of the Harraway saga unfolded not in screams or apparitions, but in the steady hand of clerks, physicians, and archivists. Yet the horror was no less for its calm presentation. If anything, it was to see cruelty itemized, graphed and catalogued is to glimpse how easily the extraordinary can be hidden within the ordinary, how the monstrous can wear the face of method. And as Greaves concluded in the final line of his report, what the Haraway ledgers teach us is not only what was done, but how thin the veil is between care and cruelty, between science and superstition, between record and requiem. By the late 1950s, the Haraway records had been sifted through countless hands, archivists catalogued, scholars debated, journalists sensationalized, yet one portion of the collection remained largely untouched, a folio of anatomical drawings, found folded into the back of Nathaniel's second ledger. For years it was assumed they were medical illustrations copied from contemporary textbooks. Only Ruth Alderton, a historian of anatomy at Harvard, examined them closely enough to see what others had missed. These were not copies, they were originals, and they were not abstracted diagrams of the human body, they were sketches of his own children. The paper was brittle, the ink browned, but the details were unmistakable. One drawing showed the elongated spine of a child, annotated with remarks about curvature. Another displayed a skull with sunken orbits, the teeth carefully numbered. In the corner of each sketch were initials, L, C, M, marking Lyle, Constance, and Mercy. Alderton's discovery stunned the panel. We had understood Nathaniel as zealot, she wrote in her notes. We had not fully understood him as anatom. The images revealed not only observation but manipulation. Lines traced where bones might be cut. Arrows indicated sites of correction. One caption read, "Were it permitted, I would excise the deformity and remake the child in purity." Though there was no evidence Nathaniel performed surgical mutilation, the very contemplation chilled even hardened physicians. Here was a man who looked upon the frailty of his children, frailty he himself had inflicted, and conceived of it as a canvas for correction. Theology and pseudoscience had fused completely, producing a vision in which suffering became data, and data became sacrament. Other documents reinforced this convergence. A long letter to Silas Quarles described Nathaniel's belief that the flesh can be shaped as clay, to fit the soul's assent. He referenced binding Constance's arms behind her back to weaken her pride, and weighing Lyle weekly to measure the waning of rebellion. He recorded hours of silence endured by Mercy as though timing an experiment. The panel's minutes from these reviews are stark. One historian noted, "What distinguishes Haraway from common cruelty is not scale but system. He devised methods, recorded outcomes, adjusted variables. It is the logic of the laboratory imposed upon the nursery." Yet Nathaniel was no trained physician. His methods were crude, guided only by borrowed fragments of science and his own fervor. He read just enough to justify what he already desired. The result was a practice that bore the trappings of medicine but none of its mercy. The attic itself still bore traces of this regimen. On the north wall, investigators found faint marks in the wood at intervals of 1 inch, extending up to 4 feet. Initially dismissed as children's notches, later analysis suggested they were height measurements, crude growth charts against which Nathaniel recorded his children's stature. The irony was unbearable. In a room where growth was deliberately stunted, the walls bore silent testimony to what was denied. Another artifact complicated the picture further, a wooden box containing small glass vials, discovered in the Haraway cellar. Labels had long since faded, but chemical analysis in the 1950s detected remnants of laudanum and vinegar. Greaves hypothesized these were administered to quiet the children when hunger left them restless. The image of a father dosing his children into silence was enough to harden even skeptics. As these findings mounted, debate turned to motive. Was Nathaniel driven by delusion, by cruelty, or by some warped sense of duty? Greaves argued that motive was secondary. Whatever the impulse, the method was clear, and it was method, not madness, that starved and silenced those children. Others countered that no sane man could construct such a ledger without the corrosion of his mind. The question remained academic. What mattered was that 3 children suffered, 2 certainly died, and 1, Mercy, vanished from the record. It was her absence that tormented Marjorie. She returned to Mercy's diary often, reciting the final lines aloud in the library where she and Elias had first heard the strange scratching overhead. "I do not think I shall wake again." The sentence ended abruptly. The ink smudged, as though the quill had been torn from her hand. "Did she die with the others?" Marjorie asked once during an interview. "Or did she escape, carrying his words inside her like a sickness?" She could not bear to think of Mercy buried in some unmarked grave, nor of her wandering broken into adulthood. Both visions were intolerable. Some genealogists, emboldened by Greaves's report, searched parish registers and orphanage rolls. A girl named Mary H. appears in records from Portland in 1855, age 12, placed in a poorhouse with no surname listed. Could it have been Mercy, misnamed or concealed? There is no proof, yet the possibility keeps the attic alive in imagination, its silence echoing into generations. By the mid-1960s, the Haraway case had become a kind of academic shorthand. Professors referenced it when speaking of the pathology of piety. Social workers cited it as a warning about unchecked authority. Physicians, especially pediatricians, used it as an example of how easily medical language can be twisted into justification for harm. But within Beacon's Hollow, the case was never abstract. For the Navarros, it was their home, and the home did not forget. Visitors often reported a heaviness upon ascending the attic stairs, even though the space had long been stripped bare. The boards creaked not just under weight but under memory. School groups sometimes left in tears, their teachers unprepared for the force of the story. One local pastor, after standing in the attic, refused ever to preach on discipline again. Elias described it best. It is not haunted by ghosts, it is haunted by by the idea that suffering could be scheduled, measured, praised. That is what lingers. The discovery of the anatomical drawings marked the true escalation of the case. They stripped away any remaining veil, showing Nathaniel not merely as fanatic, but as would-be experimenter. He had transformed his own blood into subjects, his attic into a laboratory, his guard into an alibi, and that revelation, more than any ghostly rumor, ensured that the Haraway tragedy would never fade quietly into history. It became a parable of what happens when conviction unmoored from compassion dons the cloak of science, a lesson carved not in marble or sermon, but in the bones of children, and the silence of a town. The year 1963 marked a turning point. Until then, the Haraway affair had been confined to reports, lectures, and hushed conversations among archivists. But that winter, the Maine Historical Society organized a public exhibition, Purity and Silence, the tragedy of Beacon's Hollow, and placed in its glass cases the artifacts most closely associated with the attic. At the heart of the exhibition were the anatomical drawing, framed against black felt. They seemed more dreadful than when folded in brittle ledgers. Visitors leaned close to read Nathaniel's annotations, only to recoil at the clinical precision with which he reduced his children to diagram. Alongside them, curators placed Mercy's diary, open to the smudged final page. The effect was devastating. Parents who brought their children to learn of local history, often left in tears. The display provoked controversy. Some claimed it sensationalized private tragedy. Others argued it was essential, that silence had already shielded cruelty once and must not do so again. Newspapers carried headlines: Maine town reckons with buried past, the anatomy of obedience. For the first time in more than a century, the Haraway name was on every lip in Beacon's Hollow. What few expected was the arrival of testimony from the living. On the second week of the exhibition, a woman named Alice Morton, aged 82, came forward. She claimed her grandmother had spoken of the Haraway children when Alice herself was young. She said there was crying in that house that no one dared answer. Alice told a local reporter. She said the deacons told folk to keep their doors shut. Her words ignited a flood. Elderly residents, long silent, began to share fragments of memory. One recalled seeing Constance limp in the churchyard, her wrists bound in cloth. Another spoke of hearing hymns sung at night, shrill voices that sounded more like wailing than praise. A third admitted her father had delivered food to Nathaniel, though he returned with coins rather than with empty baskets, implying that money, not mercy, kept him complicit. What emerged was a pattern not of ignorance, but of collusion. The town had known, and the town had chosen not to know. Greaves, now frail but still sharp, seized upon this. In a lecture delivered that spring, he declared, the Haraway children.
The Navarro family sat near the back of that meeting, listening. For Elias and Marjorie it was both vindication and horror. They had felt the weight of the attic in their home, the persistence of sorrow in its beams. Now they understood it was not just a father's madness that haunted the house, it was a whole town's cowardice. In private, Elias later wrote, the house was not built by Haraway alone. Each beam was laid again when a neighbor kept silent, each board nailed when the covenant was signed. No wonder the walls groan. The press seized on the story. National magazines published features with titles like The Town That Watched, and When Silence Becomes Complicity. Scholars debated whether Beacon's Hollow was an anomaly or a mirror of wider American neglect. Survivor groups, though far removed from the 1850s, adopted the case as emblematic of how communities failed children. Within the mansion itself, visitors reported an intensifying unease. The attic remained empty of artifacts, yet many claimed to hear faint tapping or to smell a sweetness like rotting flowers. One child on a school trip fainted upon entering, murmuring about the ones who are still waiting. Skeptics dismissed such tales as hysteria, but the timing was uncanny. These experiences peaked precisely when the covenant came to light. As though exposing the town's guilt awakened something restless in the air, Alderton returned to Beacon's Hollow that summer to examine the attic once more. She spent 3 hours in the space taking measurements, photographing the scratches on the walls. When she descended, her colleagues noticed her hands shaking. Asked what she had seen, she replied only, "It is not absence. It is presence." She never elaborated. By autumn, the town could no longer retreat into silence. A memorial committee was formed, though bitter arguments flared over wording. Should the plaque condemn Nathaniel alone, or the covenant signers as well? Should it name the children, Lyle, Constance, Mercy, though Mercy's fate remained uncertain? Some demanded atonement, others pleaded for rest. Meanwhile, the Navarros wrestled with their own decision. Could they remain in a house whose timbers had been consecrated in cruelty? Yet leaving felt like betrayal, abandonment of the very children whose whispers had drawn them to discovery. Marjorie, in her journal, wrote, "We are not owners here. We are witnesses, and witnesses must not flee." The confrontation of 1963 did not resolve the story. Instead, it widened it, drawing the entire town into culpability. What had begun as the tragedy of one family became the reckoning of a community, and with that reckoning, the Haraway case crossed the threshold from forgotten archive to enduring legend. For legend is not myth, but memory sharpened by guilt, and Beacon's Hollow had guilt enough to last generations. The autumn of 1964 descended upon Beacon's Hollow with a heaviness that seemed to seep into every shuttered house and frost-stiffened field. The leaves turned blood-red across the ridges, and the wind hissed through the chimneys of the Haraway mansion like a voice that would not be quieted. By then, the Navarro family had grown accustomed to the intermittent creaks and muffled sounds that seemed to rise from the attic, though neither Elias nor Marjorie dared to admit aloud that silence felt more frightening than noise. It was in late October, nearly 1 year after the Covenant's discovery, that the mansion was open to a gathering of townspeople, scholars and journalists for what would become known as the Night of Reckoning. The Historical Society, pressured by mounting public outrage, convened a forum inside the Haraway Library. Here they planned to present their final findings, including newly translated fragments of Nathaniel Haraway's sermon. The room was crowded, lanterns casting a pale glow on wood paneling darkened by decades of smoke. At the front stood Dr. Alderton, gaunt but resolute, her hands resting on a stack of papers bound in twine. She began softly, her voice carrying the gravity of liturgy. "These sermons," she said, "were delivered not to a congregation of adults, but to his children, locked within that attic. They are exhortations not of faith, but of domination." They revealed that Nathaniel Haraway believed suffering was the only true baptism. She unfolded one sheet and read, "Their cries are but proof of the flesh's rebellion. Their hunger is the Lord's chisel. I fashioned them as instruments of purity." A gasp moved through the room. Several townsfolk rose, murmuring prayers under their breath. Others wept openly. For the Navarros, who sat in the second row, the words struck like blows. Marjorie's hands clenched around her notebook until the spine cracked. Then came the diary fragments. Entries believed to be written by Constance, the eldest daughter. In cramped handwriting she described nights of binding, mornings without bread, the way her brother's breath grew shallow as his frame withered. On one page she scrawled, "We are still his lambs, but he does not lead us. He devours us." By the time Alderton finished, the room had descended into a silence so oppressive it felt like the house itself was listening. It was at that moment that Alice Morton Frail, 83, a cane in her hand, rose and addressed the gathering. "My grandmother told me she heard those cries," she said, her voice trembling. "She said the deacons told her to hush. That obedience was safety. And so did we all." Her confession unlocked others. One by one, townsfolk stood to admit what their families had witnessed. Children seen with bruises, hymns heard through shuttered windows, the unease that had gnawed but been buried under obedience to authority. Each testimony tightened the noose of guilt around Beacon's Hollow. Elias Navarro later wrote, "The air grew so dense with sorrow and shame that I feared the timbers might split. It was not a meeting, it was a trial, and the accused were the dead and the living alike." Then came the moment no one expected. As the final testimony concluded, a sharp noise echoed from above, the unmistakable sound of wood shifting, like a heavy trunk dragged across a floor. All heads tilted upward.
The attic, though sealed for decades and emptied of artifacts, seemed to some dismissed it as the groaning of old beams under autumn frost, but others, especially those seated near the back, swore they heard faint scratching, like nails on boards. A murmur rippled through the assembly. The moderator attempted to restore calm, but unease had rooted itself too deep. Someone whispered, "They're still up there." The meeting adjourned in chaos. Some fled the house altogether. Others crowded the stairs, demanding to see the attic once more. The Navarros, torn between dread and duty, led the way, opening the narrow staircase with its familiar groan. What greeted them was emptiness. The same dust, the same hollow beams, and yet, on the far wall, a new mark appeared. 3 vertical lines etched into the wood, as though carved by invisible hands, fresh, sharp, unmistakable. Marjorie fainted. Elias carried her down as whispers filled the hall. The children are not at rest. News of the incident spread beyond Maine. National newspapers ran lurid headlines. Ghosts of the attic speak again, and Haraway haunting sparks panic in Beacon's Hollow. Skeptics insisted it was hysteria, perhaps vandals. Believers claimed the children's spirits demanded more than acknowledgement. They demanded justice, denied them in life. For the Navarros, there was no escape. Reporters camped outside their home, demanding interviews. Pilgrims arrived, some bearing flowers, others crosses, a few simply staring up at the attic window as though expecting to see faces peering back. Inside the mansion, the disturbances intensified. Doors swung open at night, the smell of mildew mixed with something acrid, metallic. On more than one occasion, Elias claimed to hear children's voices reciting scripture, though the cadence was fractured, broken by sobs. Marjorie, shaken but resolute, wrote, "They will not be forgotten again. If it takes haunting, they will haunt." Meanwhile, the covenant weighed heavily on the town. Families whose ancestors had signed it faced ostracism. Children were bullied at school. Businesses boycotted. Some fled Beacon's Hollow altogether. Others dug in, insisting the past must remain. But the exhibition, the testimonies, and now the attic's uncanny disturbances made silence impossible. The climax reached its peak in December of that year, when a special service was held in the town square. Clergy, historians and citizens gathered beneath snow-laden trees to read aloud the names of the Haraway children: Lyle, Constance, Mercy, for Mercy, whose ultimate fate was uncertain. They lit a lantern and left it burning through the night. As the final prayer was spoken, witnesses reported a sound carrying from the mansion. 3 clear knocks, echoing across the frozen air. The crowd froze, breath steaming in the cold. Some crossed themselves, others fell to their knees. It was then that Alderton delivered the line that would be quoted in newspapers across the country: "The dead will not rest until the living have spoken the full truth." With those words, the Haraway case ceased to be a forgotten tragedy. It became a parable, etched into America's conscience. No longer the story of a single man's fanatic cruelty. It was the revelation of what happens when communities surrender their duty to protect the innocent. For Elias and Marjorie Navarro, the burden was now unbearable. Their dream home had become a shrine, a site of pilgrimage, a stage for history's accusations, and yet, they could not leave. As Marjorie wrote in the final lines of her diary that winter, "We are not merely keepers of a house, we are keepers of voices. If we abandon them, the silence begins again." The stage was set for the final act. The house stood, its attic scarred anew. The town trembled beneath the weight of revelation. And across the nation, readers asked themselves, if silence built the Haraway attic, how many attics still stand, sealed by obedience, waiting to be broken open? By the winter of 1965, the Navarro home, once merely another stately house among Maine's weather-beaten estates, had transformed into something heavier, almost consecrated. Its attic had been emptied, its artifacts catalogued, its bones interred in Beacon's Hollow Cemetery. Yet no one in the town called it the Navarro place anymore. It was the Haraway house, and it carried the weight of that name, like a crown of thorns. The decision of what to do with it fell first to Elias and Marjorie, who had never ceased to regard themselves as intruders in a narrative far older than their tenants. They might have sold it indeed. Offers came from collectors of the macabre, from universities seeking to establish a research center, even from a touring company eager to market it as a haunted attraction. Each offer was refused. To reduce the house to spectacle felt like a second burial, a silencing as cruel as plaster and nails. Instead, they opened the doors, carefully, reverently, without charge. School children were led through the lower rooms to hear, In simple terms, the story of what silence had allowed. Social workers and historians visited to study the covenant, the diaries, the sermons, and though some came hoping for apparitions, most left subdued, confronted not by specters but by the inescapable reality that human cruelty needs no ghosts to endure. The community itself was forced to reckon. The covenant, once a secret preserved in cedar boxes and whispered warnings, was read aloud in town hall, and entered into the municipal record. It became a symbol of complicity, of how collective silence can stretch across generations. At first, there was descendants of the signatories balked, claiming the past must remain buried, but pressure mounted, and eventually the town council erected a memorial in the square. 3 stone markers, plain but dignified, bore the names: Lyle Haraway, age 8, Constance Haraway, age 11, Mercy Haraway. Beneath the names, the inscription, "We speak for those who could not." The dedication ceremony was unlike anything Beacon's Hollow had ever seen. Families gathered in coats against the January chill. Clergy prayed, though their words faltered. Survivors of childhood cruelty, drawn from far beyond Maine, placed flowers at the base of the stones. The air was raw with wind, and yet there was stillness when the final hymn was sung. Some claimed to hear faint voices joining in, high and thin, born on the cold air. Others dismissed it as imagination, but nearly everyone left with a sense that something had shifted, that a silence 78 years deep had finally cracked. And yet the house itself did not quiet. Lias recorded in his journal that while the knocks and voices diminished, they never vanished. At odd hours he still heard the sound of pacing overhead, or the scratch of nails at the attic door. Once, while alone in the study, he heard the distinct rasp of a child's cough above him, echoing through beams that should have been long still. Marjorie, though shaken, found a form of purpose in these disturbances. She began compiling an archive within Jeremiah Haraway's old study, transforming it into a small library. She collected books and articles on child welfare, on religious extremism, on the psychology of obedience. If their voices remain, she told a visitor, then let them remind us not of ghosts, but of obligations. Visitors continued to arrive. Some were scholars, others pilgrims seeking absolution. Many wept openly upon entering the attic, now stripped bare but still oppressive in its narrow dimension. Teachers brought their pupils, urging them to count the tally marks etched into the walls, 7 by 7 by 7, until the children understood that each stroke had once been a day of waiting for release that never came. The Haraway tragedy did not remain a local matter. By the late 1960s it was cited in academic texts, in debates over child protection law, and in lectures about the dangers of religious absolutism. Activists held it up as a cautionary tale, that communities cannot avert their eyes, that faith without mercy curdles into cruelty. In 1972, a bill was introduced in the state legislature, mandating stricter oversight of religious sects operating outside conventional schooling. Its advocates called it the Haraway Law. For the Navarros, these changes brought a measure of solace, yet their lives were never truly their own again. Reporters returned every few years to mark anniversaries. Letters arrived from strangers who saw in the Haraway children echoes of their own secret suffering. Some wrote simply to say thank you. Others begged the Navarros to listen to noises in their own homes, to help them discern whether silence in the walls masked horrors yet undiscovered. And still, through all of it, the attic remained rest. On the night of December 12, 1979, 27 years after the first discovery, Marjorie awoke to find Elias standing at the foot of the attic stairs, his hand pressed to the wood. He told her he had heard a voice, faint but distinct, whispering his name. When he opened the door, the space within was darker than it should have been. As though the very air swallowed light, they retreated together, and the door was closed once more. By then they were old, their children